a stew.
A pinch of salt and laughter too.
A scoop of kids to add the spice.
A dash of love to make it nice. And you got
Too many cooks.
too many cooks.
Too many cooks. Too many cooks. Too many cooks.
Too many cooks.
Too many cooks.
It takes a lot to make a stew.
When it comes to
As the Lord of the Rings the card game entered its second year of existence in 2012, it experienced a game's version of a perfect storm. You had a player base that, having tasted a bit of what the game can do, were hungry for more expansions and more deck archetypes. As it is a deck construction game, that's one of the ways you have fun with the game. At the same time, with a year of experience under their belts, the designers of the Lord of the Rings the card game were ready to serve that meal up, as they had the experience building the relatively successful Rohan archetype and the relatively unsuccessful Eagles archetype. So it's safe to say the designers could make a deck archetype that the players can use. The third component to this perfect storm came in the form of a movie. The Hobbit: An Unexpected Journey was due for release in December of 2012. There's a rare chance for Fantasy Flight Games to use an already released game to capitalize on a release from the intellectual property. And if you've seen The Hobbit, if you're familiar with that story, there are a lot of dwarves. You know, the players are like, we want a deck. And the designers are like, you want a deck? Here's a deck.
Carmichael.
You're right. We have too many dwarves.
The resulting Dwarf Swarm deck archetype had more than enough dwarves to drown both George Clooney and Mark Wahlberg and Bill Fichtner at that point. Was this flooding of vertically challenged characters a bit of an overcorrection? Sure. But overcorrections for childhood and exaggerated personality types are what adolescence is all about. Adolescence is also a time for building some potentially lifelong friendships, as many content creators for Lord of the Rings the card game emerge in this period. So get comfortable on Jackson Warfield's therapy couch, because in part 4 today, we'll be unpacking the adolescent years of the Lord of the Rings the card game.
Who is that? He doesn't look very happy.
It is dead, Lord of the Iron Hills. Sauron's cousin.
Like dwarves digging for Mithril, we will continue to dig through the different expansions that came out in January of 2012. The first deluxe expansion for the Lord of the Rings the card game was released, Khazad-Dum, which would then be followed by the Dwaro-Delph cycle, which, if you actually look to what those names mean, they mean the same thing. Khazad-Dum and Dwaro-Delph was the first example of expansions for Lord of the Rings the card game. It's tough enough when you have an expansion where you have to write on the box to say, this is an expansion to another game, don't buy this by itself. Even I have made the mistake once of buying an expansion for a game and not buying the actual game. I thought it was an expand-alone, not with Lord of the Rings. It was actually with Stuffed Fables. But nonetheless, if you wanted to play all the scenarios of the Dwaro-Delph cycle, you needed to have both the core set for Lord of the Rings and the Khazad-Dum expansion. With 10 years to learn from producing games, Fantasy Flight would get rid of the expansion of expansion model when they re-released and repackaged some of the Lord of the Rings the card game content, but that is more of a topic for another video. Khazad-Dum itself featured 2 heroes, Dwalin and Bifur, which brings our number of dwarf heroes up to 6, where you have Glóin, Gimli, and Thalin from the core set, Dain Ironfoot from the Shadows of Mirkwood cycle, and now Dwalin and Bifur. You got 3 dwarf allies. My favorite card from this set was probably the Dwaro-Delph Axe, which I don't understand how anyone can say that the Dwarven Axe is better than the Dwaro-Delph Axe. One of note here was also the Sigil Miner. You see, the Sigil Miner was arguably the first truly broken card in Lord of the Rings the card game. There were a number of cards throughout the game's early years that ended up needing an errata, but the Sigil Miner was perhaps the most extreme, and people knew it right from the get-go. You effectively had 2 dwarf deck styles that were in their infancy here, using lots of different terms, euphemisms for age, I guess. You had dwarf decks which centered around Dain Ironfoot. Dain would give strong willpower across the board, and the goal was just get as many dwarves out as possible. That was the Dwarf Swarm deck. You also had dwarf mining decks, which is more along the lines of what Sigil Miner does, which was dig through your deck or discard pile to find cards and build resources that way. The quests of Khazad-Dum were not anything to write home about. Now, it was a welcome break to not need to see the Necromancer's Reach anymore. After all, the encounter cards from the core set you saw used throughout the Shadows of Mirkwood cycle, so some of your most disliked encounter cards would show up many times. This was the first expansion that did not use any encounter sets from the core set. My biggest impression from Khazad-Dum was the fact that you had a mix of small little orcs, or really goblins, but they're, kind of the same thing, and really large trolls that would even make the hill troll from the core set seem small. The 3 quests within Khazad-Dum were Into the Pit, which saw the heroes breaking into Moria, the 7th level, which was getting to the 7th level of Moria, and Flight from Moria, where they escape Moria. If that sounds familiar, it's because it is. It's similar to the Fellowship's trip through Moria in the Lord of the Rings story, although it is a separate adventure. For example, the quest does reference Balin's tomb. Only 2 months later, players were graced with another expansion. This was the Red Horn Gate. Red Horn Gate's hero was actually not a dwarf. It was Elrond's son, Elrohir. And Elrohir mentioned Eladon, which is Elrond's other son. Elrohir and Eladon are twins. Eladon was not quite available, although you would be able to buy that set within about a month or so. The Red Horn Gate is notable for introducing, or attempting to introduce, secrecy decks. You see, the Lord of the Rings card game never required that you choose 3 heroes to start every quest. Yet, almost everyone chose 3 heroes. In fact, I don't think I saw any competitive decks in the early life of the game that used only 2 heroes, God forbid only 1 hero. The designers left that open. They didn't require 3 heroes, so they wanted you to be able to go with 2 as a different strategy, add some variety to the game. They saw this wasn't happening. My only assumption is that's why they introduced secrecy. Secrecy cards were cards you could buy at a discount, provided your threat was 20 or less. And Timely Aid was the first of those cards. That deck archetype would eventually go very well with some other cards that would be released. It did not fit very well with dwarves, and really wasn't a thing in the early stages here of the Dwarven Elf cycle. The Red Horn Gate refers to Caradhras, which is the mountain that the Fellowship failed to pass in the Fellowship of the Ring,
We will go through the mines.
and thus went to Moria. So again, our story is a little bit, if not unoriginal, maybe a little bit uninspired. There's another way that the designers of the game were maturing in their storytelling direction. Road to Rivendell brought out Elrohir's twin brother Eladon, a couple more secrecy cards, and some more dwarf cards, including Lure of Moria, which allows you to ready all dwarves, which, given how many doors you have at this point, is that's a lot of dwarves. The game also had the beginnings of another broken combo that would need to be eroded with the Song of Earendel. When paired with Wandering Took from the core set, would allow you to massage threat levels between 2 players as much as you want. It's already kind of strange to allow, but we get even stranger with following expansions. What Road to Rivendell is really known for is having the single worst encounter card in the history of the game, with Sleeping Sentry. If you revealed Sleeping Sentry, you had to deal 1 damage to every exhausted character and then exhaust all ready characters. Which means that if you got another Sleeping Sentry after it, the already exhausted characters would get another damage, and now everyone else would get 1 damage. It was really bad. In fact, it's like Necromancer's Reach on Lemba's bread. As a shadow effect, probably even worse, because you had to discard all exhausted characters. This was another example of game design that is just not really fair. You could not play this game without a Test of Will and Hasty Stroke as cancellation effects. In fact, you had to pretty much bust out Eleanor from the core set, if not fully cancel, at least prevent certain when revealed effects from firing. This is probably one of the less replayed quests in the history of the game because of Sleeping Sentry. Also of note is you had objective ally Arwen. Became an ally that you could play in The Watcher in the Water. The Watcher in the Water is a fan favorite quest that was one of the first boss fights in the history of the game. All of the enemies in The Watcher in the Water were pretty much tentacles coming from the Watcher. So if you know that scene in The Lord of the Rings, that's what the Watcher in the Water quest was. The Watcher in the Water was also the Aragorn pack, where you had another Aragorn hero, and that's actually the first hero to get more than 1 hero card. So you had, as players of the game would say, Loragorn, to differentiate from Leadership Aragorn. Now this is Lore Aragorn. Aragorn has an ability that allows you to reset your threat once per game. I mentioned before the ability to pass threat as you wish between two players using Song of Eärendil and Wandering Took. Well, now imagine this. Player A and player B are both at 30 threat. Player A passes 20 threat to player B and brings their threat down to 10. And player B, who has Loragorn, drops their threat back to the starting level, which maybe is 30, or maybe it's even less. So that obviously had to get fixed. But also to go along with the Aragorn decks, you had a Sword That Was Broken, which is a great way to power up Aragorn. And you also had Ally Arwen, which goes great with Aragorn. This was the beginning of the designers of Lord of the Rings, the card game, giving players interesting deck building options in single expansions. That means putting 2 or 3 cards together that could be the core of a deck by themselves. After the Watcher in the Water came the Long Dark. I barely remember what actually happens in the quest. One of the more forgettable quests in the history of the game. Most memorable is not the fact that you had even more additions to Dwarf Swarm with Erebor Battlemaster and the Ringmail attachment, but you had Hama, who also would need to be...
What is it? Hama? I'm not sure.
Hama allowed you to reuse event cards from your discard pile, which was effectively a way to circumvent the 3-card limit for deck construction for Lord of the Rings, the card game. So it was eventually errated to prevent you from doing that and using his ability more than 3 times. Foundations of Stone was the 5th expansion in the Dwarven Elf cycle, and it was another expansion that was centered around one hero. This was the Glorfindel pack. Now, this is by far the better Glorfindel card. Glorfindel is a hero where he only has 5 threats, so he allows you to start the game with very low threat. In fact, actually potentially triggering secrecy. If Glorfindel exhausts to commit to the quest, your threat goes up by 1, unless you have Light of Valinor. Not only that, but if you attach Asphalloth to Glorfindel and basically give him his horse to ride, you can also start dropping progress on locations in the staging area. That paired with Daeron's Rooms and Eladri's Stargazer, which made Sigil Minor an extremely powerful card until Sigil Minor was eroded. And Foundations of Stone was one of the must-have expansions if you wanted to build strong decks, which was of interest for players of Lord of the Rings, the card game at this point because the game was still pretty difficult. Foundations of Stone refers to Moria, which is where the quest takes place, and actually has one of my favorite enemies in the game, which is the Nameless Thing. Like, look at that thing. That thing's cool, the Nameless Thing. It doesn't even have a name. Like, what is that? I don't know. But that's a big Tolkien thing to refer to things as nameless things. It adds a lot of mystery to it. It's pretty cool. The ultimate expansion in the Dwarven cycle was Shadow and Flame. Shadow and Flame was the Elrond pack. Elrond was one of the most powerful heroes in the game, maybe the most powerful, especially when you attach Vilya to him. So Vilya is his ring of power. And Vilya, when attached to Elrond, which is the only character you can attach Vilya to, allows you to just drop allies into play. 5 cost, 6 cost, doesn't matter. They show up. Pair with an Eladri's Stargazer, and you know exactly what you're bringing into play as well. The quest itself was a boss battle. Shadow and Flame, you jump into the boss battle right away. Compared to earlier quests in the history of the game, where you maybe faced a boss in quest stage 3, or the final quest stage, so you had a chance to build up your board state, and then the enemies tended to be fairly typical, just very strong. Shadow and Flame had you facing Durin's Bane, at first glance appears to be indestructible. So if you like boss battles, this was one of the expansions for you. Shadow and Flame was released in August of 2012, which is also when the Hobbit Saga expansion was released. But before we get into the Hobbit, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the creators that were on the scene at this point in the game's history. Perhaps most notable of them was Cardboard of the Rings. By late 2012, Cardboard of the Rings had already been around for over a year. Perhaps the most prominent Lord of the Rings a card game podcast. After all, they're at episode 237 as of the recording of this video. So they got a pretty cool logo. And of all the clever titles, I'd say Cardboard of the Rings is fairly catchy. They started in April of 2011. So Cardboard of the Rings has been there for players as almost an expansion of its own. So if you get into the game, you get to enjoy Cardboard of the Rings. In late 2012, so not that long after Shadow and Flame, Ian R. Martin released Tales from the Cards. Tales from the Cards features reviews of not just expansions, but of heroes within the expansions. Multiple reviews per expansion. Endless content to digest. My most utilized blog that started in this time frame was Hall of Beorn. In fact, earlier this week, I got worried because 2 of the websites I typically go to grab card art for my slides here were down. and I had to use the Hall of Bjorn products guide, which came in super handy. And in early 2013 came Master of Lore, which is a blog that focuses on the lore of the Lord of the Rings, the card game. Despite all the game's shortcomings from a game design perspective, you already, again, had prominent blogs that had many years of content to come, which should illustrate how enjoyable and how deep the gameplay in this game actually can get. Promptly after the Dwarf cycle wrapped up, you had the first of the Saga expansions for the Lord of the Rings, the card game. The Hobbit expansion, the first of which was Overhill and Underhill. I'm going to review both of these boxes before jumping to the next cycle of the game, even though On the Doorstep came in the middle of that cycle because these obviously somewhat go together. The Saga expansions for Lord of the Rings, the card game, were coherent stories, which took quests that often, even though they had a story to them, felt like one-off adventures and gave you campaign mode, which allowed you to carry over cards such as found treasure for one scenario to the next. The Overhill and Underhill expansion gave you a lot more player cards to work with than Khazad-Dum did. Most notably, it gave you 5 heroes, 4 of which you actually could use outside of the Hobbit. The hero you could not use was Bilbo. Bilbo Baggins should stick out a little bit here because Bilbo Baggins was part of the Baggins sphere. No, this was not a 5th sphere added to the game, because the only cards that work for the Baggins sphere were released in the Hobbit Saga expansions. So it was a Saga-specific sphere. There's effectively a 4th hero, though, that you could put in play. So we had a lot going on with these quests. The dwarf heroes of Thorin, Nori, and Ori brought us up to, I believe, 9 dwarf heroes at this point in the game. Although I think the most interesting hero in this pack was Beorn, with 10 life and only 1 defense, but the ability to defend as much as you'd want within a turn. It was a fun hero to play with, and actually was pretty strong early on in the game. You had another Gandalf to play with. Of course, that Gandalf came into play, made a lot of things happen, and then left. Hobbit Gandalf, ideally you get this Gandalf in play early on in the game. Allows you to get a really strong boost for as long as you can handle having him with you. He cranks your threat up pretty quick as long as you do. So ideally you have Gandalf in to get a fast start to the game. Because after all, this is a deck construction game where you start with no cards in play besides your heroes. Getting a fast start is a welcome addition. Eventually, easy mode would be added to Lord of the Rings card game, and that allows you to start the game with a resource on each hero, which gave you effectively 6 resources to work with on the first turn instead of 3. Easy mode also got rid of certain cards from encounter sets, but very often when you're playing the game, especially at this stage of the game's life, if you're going to lose, you might have an idea pretty soon when you're playing because you never quite get your card engine going. All the allies in this set were dwarves. You had Fili, Keely, Bofer, and Dori. And add this to the dwarves that we've already gotten from Khazad-Dum and Dwarf, and you understand what's going on with the Dwarf Swarm here. The 3 quests in this box were not amazing. They're very swingy quests, which was true of many quests early on in the game. That's not to say that this didn't do a good job of going through the Hobbit story. First you battle out with trolls, then you have to deal with the stone giants. You had a chance to pick up some of the treasures that Thorin's company pick up during the Hobbit story, and you eventually create a split quest situation where Bilbo has a riddle match with Gollum. On the Doorstep picks up where Overhill and Underhill left off, with a new Bilbo, a slightly more well-rounded Bilbo, another Baggins sphere card, and even more dwarves. Between Balin, Owen, and Bomber, you had 11 total dwarf heroes in the game. And if you include all of the dwarf allies of these 2 sets, you now had the 13 dwarves, in addition to Bilbo, that were part of Thorin's company. On the Doorstep also featured Bard the Bowman, who is such a strong ranged character that I always refer to him as Bard the Bomber. You got the Black Arrow and other attachments that make ranged characters even more effective. The quests for this set fight the spiders in Mirkwood, dealing with Smaug inside the mountain, and then the Battle of 5 Armies. Not the Battle of the 5 Armies, the Battle of 5 Armies. If you wanted to see what happened when Smaug got pissed off and went to go blow up Lake Town, where he would eventually meet his demise, you had a Gen Con expansion, the second Gen Con expansion in the history of the game, the Battle of Lake Town. The first Gen Con expansion, the Massing of Osgiliath, was almost and arguably the most difficult quest in the game until the Battle of Lake Town was released. It had you actually fighting Smaug. This quest really goes with the Hobbit quests, giving you a 7-quest story to play out. On the Doorstep was released in February of 2013. 2013 would feature the next cycle of the game, but also would see the emergence of even more content creators that helped enhance the experience for Lord of the Rings the card game players. You had the first content from the Grey Company podcast, which, while not quite as prolific as Cardboard of the Rings, had 69 episodes through 2019. And I would be remiss not to mention the 10th Nazgul.
That is my jam.
Which is the combo of Mitch from Cardboard of the Rings and Matthew from the Grey Company, which put together progression series videos through the first several cycles of the game. 10th Nazgul is notable for showing how to use the Octagon software if you wanted to play the Lord of the Card game on your computer. Also makes a great drinking game if you drink every time one of them says, be that as it may. The next deluxe expansion was the Heirs of Numenor, which refers to Gondor. This set kicked off the cycle of 2013, which was the Against the Shadow cycle. Now, Heirs of Numenor is another mixed bag. You see, you got some cool heroes and cool player cards here. You had Leadership Boromir as a hero, and you had Baragond. You notice Baragond here has a number 4 on the defense side. I'll tell you what, that was a welcome addition. Getting some sort of a hero that has not only 4 defense, but also 4 health, and could take attachments easily. Baragond was immediately one of the best heroes in the game. When I first played the game, I played progression style. So when I was working through, I remember reading online about everyone using Baragond at the time, and I was like, man, I really wish I had Baragond here, but I wasn't allowing myself to do it. I wanted to play pure progression style. The thing with Heirs of Numenor is the quests. I've already mentioned many times how hard this game was. In the Heirs of Numenor quest, it was brutal. You had Peril and Pelargir as the first quest in the game, which was hard, but not table-flipping difficult. But then Into Athelion and the Siege of Caer Andros were so hard that a lot of people, I believe, just left the game at this point.
I'm not playing anymore.
After going from Dwarf Swarm, and then when they finally got out of Dwarf Swarm, they just get stomped by these ridiculous quests. I get it.
I'm out.
But if you can look past that difficulty, they did add some interesting mechanics to the game that would be used a lot later. Archery keyword, which dealt direct damage to your characters, which made it harder to build up a massive army of dwarves or otherwise, and forced players to play differently than a lot of the power decks of the time would play. But also added different quest types. See, most quests would use willpower as the trait you use to advance in a quest. Battle quests require to use your attack value. Willpower is easily the most important trait for characters in the game to this point, so having some quests that used attack as the trait you actually quest with immediately made other characters more valuable. The siege keyword was you would use your defense trait to quest, so these are great ways to add theme and immersion, even if not everyone got to fully experience it because they focused on how freaking difficult these things were. If Khazad-Dum and Dwarf is the high school phase for Lord of the Rings, the card game, and maybe The Hobbit is a year of junior college to get your grades up, Heirs of Numenor and Against the Shadow was going off to college, and talk about making dramatic decisions on a whim here. The first expansion, Against the Shadow, might be the most infamous individual quest expansion. Players now had a handful of deck options. They could play Dwarf Swarm, they could play Rohan decks, they could play Secrecy decks if they really wanted it to be difficult. And perhaps because the expansion was so dispersed and where you had to buy expansions of expansions, they wanted to make it easy to build a deck. So they released the Steward's Sphere, which was a deck
In a box,
and it was the Outlands deck in one box.
in a box.
You had here Lewin the Fair, who starts off, he looks kind of weak, but
Take a look inside.
you had 4 allies that would go into play, where it was a simple mechanic. The more allies of that type are in play, the more they buff the traits of all of the Outlands characters out there. You would have something like, you could potentially have double-digit characters in play that have 2, 3, or 4 for their traits for willpower, attack, defense, and health. The Steward's Sphere is an interesting quest because you're going to face one of 3 big bads in the quest, but Steward's Sphere is just known for being the Outlands deck. Let's say it was a little bit too much. This is the last time they're steadily beating you up with dwarves and then stomping the player after going dwarves, 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 followed by Outlands. The designer's kind of dialed it back a little bit with getting too cute with making making individual decks in a box.
In a box.
The next expansion was the Druidon Forest. And the Druidon Forest, this is where more options for secrecy decks. Merlond is a great hero for dropping your initial threat level. If you also pair it with Monosphere decks. So the Monosphere deck concept would give you bonuses if all 3 of your heroes were from the same sphere. Having all 3 heroes from the same sphere was another thing that was largely missing from the early years of the game. Just like decks that featured less than 3 heroes, having decks that featured 3 heroes from the same sphere was fairly rare. So designers directly programmed benefits for Monosphere decks right into some of the expansions and Against the Shadow. The Druidon Forest was also interesting because of the enemies fought some woes as you went through the Druidon Forest, which are characters that are part of Middle-earth and weren't mentioned in the Lord of the Rings movies. So it did make you feel like you were going deeper into Middle-earth compared to the earlier sets of the game. The Against the Shadows cycle had you going in and around Gondor accomplishing missions, which was the first time the game actually set you on quests that were not very similar to established lore. In Khazad-Dum, you went into Moria, and then, you kind of got close to Durnsbane and you left. They named Durnsbane. In the Dwarf cycle, you did the same thing, and you even hit, Caradhras and Caradhras. I'm going to pronounce it right. And the Watcher in the Water on the way into Moria, and then you did the same thing in Moria again. The Shadows of Mirkwood cycle follows the story of the Hunt for Gollum, which is an actual story, which some of you may know there is a Hunt for Gollum movie coming out, I think, in 2026. It's one of the more notable stories that has yet to be covered on the big screen for Lord of the Rings. And speaking of going in and around Gondor, Encounter at Amon Dîn is actually pretty cool because if you look at maps of Middle-earth, sometimes it actually shows Amon Dîn. They're like, hey, played a quest around there. Encounter at Amon Dîn had Pippin as a hero, which was also well-timed because the Lord of the Rings saga, where you're about to get a lot more hobbits, was just around the corner. Encounter at Amon Dîn had a character introduced. You had Lord Alcaron as an objective ally. Lord Alcaron was one of the first characters that wasn't a hero card that was really developed during the course of Lord of the Rings, the card game, if you follow the stories of the expansions. Encounter at Amon Dîn also leaned a little bit into Ranger decks and some of the first hints of trap decks. Which are one of my favorite deck ideas, even if they're definitely not one of the strongest decks in the game. Assault on Osgiliath busted out Faramir as a hero, which seemed a little bit overdue. It also gave you a little bit more Outlands cards, if that wasn't already strong enough. The Palantir was well-themed, in my opinion, because it was a card that lets you gamble a little bit. The more you used it, the stronger you get, but the more you raise your threat, which is kind of like how the Palantir kind of works. The Blood of Gondor, which had maybe some of the best cover art of any of the expansions with that, I think it's a Black Numenorian, was most notable for hero Caldara. I mentioned before that the designers wised up a little bit after the Steward's Fear. The reason why I said a little bit is because Caldara decks are arguably the strongest decks in the game. It's not a deck in a box the same way Outlands works. Caldara leaves play and allows you to put one spirit ally into play for each other spirit hero you control. So if you went mono spirit, discarding Caldara gives you 2 spirit allies, potentially very strong spirit allies. And eventually you would get Prince Imrahil as a spirit ally, who's a card that generated resources like a hero. Caldara decks were strong in the beginning, then got very strong. Caldara would also get an errata to prevent Caldara from re-entering play with Fortune and Feint and triggering her ability again, which was another endless loop and was kind of silly. Then the final expansion of Against the Shadow was the Morgul Veil. Theoden as a hero was quite the awesome card here, partially because Theoden's one of my favorite characters from the movies, but also he's a strong card and he was someone who could retroactively make some of your Rohan decks stronger. Ered Nimra's Prospector seemed like a totally unnecessary additional dwarf, but you got another dwarf here. But I mostly remember the Morgul Veil for being really, really difficult solo. This is the quest that I tried the most times before defeating solo. More than Masking on Osgiliath, more than any of the Heirs of Numenor quests. Because Murzog, that orc captain over there to the right, starts quests in play, and if you don't get rid of him quickly, it's kind of a hill troll situation. The Gen Con expansion at the end of the Against the Shadow cycle was the Stone of Erech, which this time was not another step up in difficulty. It was kind of a break, which was honestly kind of nice. Falderafin, who basically was the Middle-earth version of a kid who just kind of got lost. It was a fun quest that used daytime, midnight, and dusk mechanics that changed how encounter cards actually function. If you're new to Lord of the Rings, the card game, and you're shopping around for cards to buy, you might not have recognized a lot of the sets that I've talked through in this video or in part 3 of my Lord of the Rings card game series,
The greatest modern card game.
There's a reason for that. Early on in the game's history, the scenario design and the card design was sloppier than it was several years into the game's life. Thus, when sets were repackaged for sale in the 2020s, not everything got repackaged. The Hobbit Saga expansions were not repackaged. The core set was repackaged, but none of the sets here were repackaged. Instead, what they did was they took some of the best cards from these sets and they put them into the starter decks that you can buy. So we're looking here, this is in chronological order by cycle. So first you have the core set over there to the left, followed by Khazad-Dum, and implied there is Khazad-Dum and the Dwarf Elf cycle. And the other sets we talked about today, the Hobbit Saga expansions and Heirs of Numenor. What I listed here is the number of cards from each cycle that are featured in the starter decks. The core set features 27, most of which are just bringing up to 3 copies of a lot of cards in the core set. I think 16 of the 27 were cards from the core set. Khazad-Dum featured 17 cards that moved into starter decks. Hobbit expansions featured 11, and Heirs of Numenor 21. It wasn't until the Lord of the Rings saga began where the design of Lord of the Rings, the card game expansions, was so strong that it was worth repackaging, which is actually a very good thing, because if the beginning of the Lord of the Rings saga expansion weren't well designed, and it's a really good series of quests and good cards, it would be unfortunate to have the repackaged Lord of the Rings saga either be incomplete or be kind of shaky from the get-go. Even though Voice of Isengard didn't get a repackaged expansion, I really consider the Black Riders as the coming-of-age set for Lord of the Rings, the card game. Now, having finished school...
When I graduated first grade, all my father did was tell me to get a job.
It was time for the game to grow up. And as the game grew up, more friends would be had. We're not done talking about content creators here. You had the blog Darkling Door, which came into being around the time when you had enough cards available in the Lord of the Rings the card game where you could have powerful decks that had a chance to complete scenarios, and they were also thematic. Darkling Door also appreciated for the Tales of Years campaign, which is a way to actually design a campaign of all the quests in the game. You had more blogs like Vision of the Palantir. You had the emergence of C-Stan, who's not just famous for his Expecting Mischief blog, but being one of the heroes of content creators for the game. While I was compiling materials to film this video, RingsDB, which is an amazing deck building website that I spent hours on when rocking my current 5-year-old to sleep when he was an infant, was down. C-Stan had posted on the Lord of the Rings the card game subreddit saying that the website was down and he was working to get it up. It is 2025. The game is 14 years old at this point, and he's working tirelessly to get a website back up and running. And he got it up and running. In fact, I guess I can't really call it RingsDB anymore. IP address 104.131.0.165. Excellent fan-made website. He's also, as I understand, responsible for Dragon Cards and is the lead designer in the A Long Expected Party fan expansions that we will eventually cover in this series. The Mike Vincent YouTube series on Lord of the Rings the card game, circa 2014, was one of the things that inspired me to make YouTube videos in the first place. Because after all, if you look at my channel, one of the first videos I made was top 10 heroes of the core set, because I thought that more people in addition to Mike Vincent should be making lists like that. Card Talk Dave came online in 2018. To this point, he has put out 630 videos. The man is a machine. And perhaps the greatest YouTube video in the history of the game wasn't released until 2022. The Game Locker's How to Play video, which is actually a little bit different from the Mike Vincent videos, was so good that I didn't see much of a point for doing a How to Play video myself, because that's kind of, you can't do better than that video. It was really well done. In part 5 of this series, the game has entered its prime. We're going to go over what that prime was like. Some of the different sets, the places they would take you in Middle-earth, what it was like to play a game where you had deck construction options that were both thematic and effective. And we'll also talk a little bit more about the other alternatives that were starting to pop up, and why you might choose to play Lord of the card game over, say, Arkham Horror the card game, or perhaps the video game adaptation of Lord of the Rings the card game. If you enjoy this series, remember to subscribe to Jackson Warfield's Game Room so you'll be there when the next one gets released. And I'll see you in part 5.